Sleep has always been a quiet mystery. Long before electric lights, alarm clocks, and glowing screens, human beings learned to surrender to the night in ways that now feel distant and unfamiliar. In the ancient world, sleep was not optimized, measured, or discussed in terms of productivity. It arrived slowly, carried by darkness, silence, and the natural rhythm of the body itself. When the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, there was no sudden switch from day to night. Shadows stretched gradually across fields, streets, and stone walls. Fires were dimmed, lamps were lit sparingly, and voices softened as evening settled in. The night did not rush. It unfolded. And with it came rest, not as a goal to be achieved, but as a state the body gently entered. For people living thousands of years ago, sleep was shaped by the world around them. The sound of insects, the movement of wind through trees, the distant calls of animals, and the slow cooling of the air all played their part. Darkness was complete in a way we rarely experience now. Without artificial light, the stars were not decorative but constant companions, hanging above every village, city, and river. In this quiet world, sleep was neither guaranteed nor feared. It was accepted. People did not expect uninterrupted nights or perfect rest. Waking during the night was normal. Falling asleep early was natural. The body followed patterns guided by daylight, labor, and the changing seasons. Rest was not something to control, but something to listen for. Across ancient civilizations, from river valleys to stone-built cities, people developed simple ways to sleep within their environment. They adapted to heat and cold, to noise and silence, to shared spaces and solitude. Their nights were shaped by belief as much as by habit. Dreams carried meaning. Darkness held presence. The act of lying down was both ordinary and quietly profound. Tonight, as we begin this calm journey through the ancient world, there is no need to hurry. These stories are not meant to be absorbed all at once. They are meant to unfold slowly, just as night once did. As we move through distant times and forgotten routines, the pace will remain gentle, steady, and unforced. In the stillness of the ancient night, sleep was never an escape from life. It was simply another part of it. And it is there, in that shared human experience, that our journey begins. Before cities glowed through the night and streets remained awake until morning, darkness ruled the ancient world completely. When the sun set, the day truly ended. There were no bright windows in the distance, no humming machines, no constant background noise. Night arrived as a physical presence, slowly covering the land and reshaping how people moved, spoke, and rested. In this world before electricity, the night was guided by the sky itself. The moon determined how visible the roads would be. Clouds could erase all light at once, leaving villages wrapped in deep shadow. Stars were sharp and countless, stretching across the heavens in patterns that people recognized as carefully as landmarks on the ground. Time was measured not by clocks, but by the movement of constellations and the gradual passage of darkness toward dawn. As evening settled in, daily life began to quiet. Work ended not because of schedules, but because sight failed. Tools were set aside. Fires were tended carefully, kept low to preserve fuel and safety. Families gathered closer together, sharing the last moments of light before rest. The transition from wakefulness to sleep was slow and deliberate, shaped by habit rather than instruction. Sound traveled differently at night. Without daytime activity, even small noises felt amplified. The rustling of leaves, the crack of cooling wood, or distant footsteps carried across open spaces. These sounds were familiar, not alarming. They formed a kind of nighttime language that people learned from childhood, allowing them to sense the presence of others and the rhythms of the natural world. Darkness also shaped the body itself. Without artificial light, the eyes adjusted gradually. Movement slowed. The body responded to fading light by preparing for rest, guided by internal rhythms that aligned closely with the rising and setting of the sun. Sleep did not require effort. It followed naturally, arriving as the final task of the day. In this environment, night was not something to be filled or distracted from. It was respected. It marked a clear boundary between activity and rest, between labor and stillness. The absence of light created space for reflection, quiet conversation, and eventually, sleep. As we move deeper into the ancient world, we begin with this shared foundation. No matter the civilization, no matter the culture, every night began the same way. With the sun gone, the world slowed, and sleep found its place in the darkness. In ancient Egypt, sleep unfolded in close harmony with the land and the river that shaped daily life. The Nile governed work, movement, and rest, and its steady rhythms extended into the night. As daylight faded over mud brick homes and cultivated fields, families prepared for rest in spaces that were simple, practical, and deeply familiar. Most Egyptians slept inside modest houses built to keep out heat during the day and retain warmth at night. Rooms were sparsely furnished. There were no separate bedrooms in the modern sense. Sleep took place wherever space allowed, often on rooftops during warmer seasons, where cooler air moved freely beneath the stars. The open sky above was a constant presence, offering relief from heat and a sense of connection to the gods. Beds, when used, were low and uncomplicated. Many people rested on woven mats or linen-covered frames, elevated slightly above the ground. Wooden headrests were common, curved to support the neck while leaving the head raised. These were not designed for softness, but for comfort within the body's natural alignment. Sleep was practical, not indulgent. The Egyptians believed that night was a vulnerable time, when unseen forces moved more freely. For this reason, sleep was closely tied to protection and belief. Amulets were kept nearby. Short prayers were spoken quietly before lying down. Lamps burned low, casting soft shadows along the walls, while incense sometimes filled the air with familiar scents meant to calm both body and spirit. Dreams held special importance in Egyptian culture. They were not dismissed as random images, but understood as meaningful messages, sometimes sent by the gods themselves. Certain temples even served as places where people would sleep deliberately, hoping to receive guidance through dreams. Rest, in this sense, was both physical and spiritual. Despite these beliefs, sleep itself remained simple. After long days of labor under the sun, exhaustion came naturally. The body yielded easily to rest. Nights were rarely silent. The sounds of insects, animals, and distant water blended into a steady background that people learned to ignore or even find comforting. As darkness deepened along the Nile, sleep arrived not as an escape, but as a continuation of life's rhythm. The same forces that guided planting and harvest also guided rest. In ancient Egypt, to sleep was to align oneself quietly with the world as it was, and with the unseen currents believed to flow through it. In ancient Greece, sleep was understood not only as a physical necessity, but as a gentle crossing into a different state of being. The Greeks gave sleep a name, a presence, and even a family among the gods. Hypnos, the personification of sleep, was imagined as a quiet figure who arrived softly, without force, bringing rest to both mortals and immortals alike. Greek homes were built around open courtyards, allowing air and light to move freely throughout the space. As evening approached, daily activity withdrew inward. Lamps were lit carefully, their flames small and steady. Sleep did not take place in heavily separated rooms. It happened within shared living spaces, where familiarity and routine created a sense of ease. Beds were simple frames of wood, often fitted with ropes or woven supports and covered with thin mattresses filled with wool or plant fibers. Sheets and blankets were light, adjusted according to the season. Comfort came not from softness, but from repetition and familiarity. The body learned where and how to rest. The Greeks paid close attention to the relationship between sleep and health. Rest was considered essential to balance, both physical and mental. Physicians observed how sleep affected the body, and philosophers reflected on its role in restoring harmony after the exertions of the day. Falling asleep was not seen as weakness, but as a natural return to equilibrium. Night in Greek cities was quieter than day, though never entirely silent. Distant footsteps echoed along stone streets. Dogs barked occasionally. The murmur of voices faded as households settled into rest. Without artificial light, movement slowed naturally, and the boundaries of the night were respected. Dreams occupied a special place in Greek thought. Like the Egyptians, the Greeks believed that dreams could carry meaning, offering insight or warning. Shrines dedicated to healing often encouraged visitors to sleep within their walls, trusting that rest would bring guidance through dreams. Yet even outside sacred spaces, dreams were spoken of carefully, with curiosity rather than fear. As the night deepened, sleep arrived gradually. There was no urgency to surrender to it. People rested when the body signaled readiness. In ancient Greece, sleep was woven quietly into daily life, guided by habit, belief, and the steady passing of darkness toward dawn. In ancient Rome, sleep reflected the complexity of a world that was growing larger, busier, and more densely populated. Roman cities did not fully rest at night, yet even within their movement and noise, sleep found its place through adaptation rather than control. Rest was shaped by social class, location, and the steady routines of daily life. Roman homes varied widely. In wealthy households, bedrooms were arranged around inner courtyards, shielded from the street by thick walls. These spaces were designed to remain cool and quiet, especially during the warmer months. Beds were sturdier than those of earlier cultures, often built with wooden frames and fitted with mattresses filled with wool, feathers, or straw. Blankets and coverings were layered as needed, responding to changes in temperature. For poorer citizens living in crowded apartment buildings, sleep was less private. Many shared rooms with family members, and sometimes with lodgers. Streets below remained active late into the night, filled with carts, vendors, and distant voices. Because of this, Romans often adjusted their sleeping habits, resting when they could rather than expecting long, uninterrupted nights. Artificial lighting existed, but it was limited. Oil lamps provided only a soft glow and were used sparingly. Fire was both valuable and dangerous, so households remained cautious after dark. As a result, night still encouraged rest rather than activity. Even in a bustling empire, darkness imposed limits. Roman writers commented on sleep often. Some praised early rest as a sign of discipline, while others accepted fragmented sleep as normal. It was common to wake during the night, especially in urban areas, and then return to rest later. These interruptions were not considered a problem, but simply part of life. Bathing played an important role in preparing for sleep. Many Romans visited bathhouses in the late afternoon or early evening, allowing warmth and relaxation to settle into the body before nightfall. Cleanliness and calm were closely linked to rest, even among those who lived modestly. Despite the noise of the city, sleep in ancient Rome remained an accepted and necessary pause. The empire may have stretched across continents, but the human body still obeyed the same rhythms. As lamps dimmed and streets gradually quieted, Romans surrendered to rest, adapting gently to the world around them. Across the ancient world, bedtime was rarely a sudden event. There were no strict hours, no alarms announcing when rest should begin. Instead, the transition into sleep was guided by small, familiar routines that gently signaled the body to slow down. These nightly habits were simple, repeated, and deeply personal. As evening approached, people prepared themselves quietly. Hands and faces were washed, dust from the day removed with water drawn from nearby sources. Clothing was loosened or set aside. In warmer regions, bodies were cooled by the night air. In colder climates, additional layers were gathered, arranged carefully to conserve warmth. These actions were unhurried, performed in the same order night after night. Light played an important role in these routines. Lamps were trimmed and dimmed rather than extinguished all at once. Flames flickered softly, casting moving shadows that signaled the approach of rest. The gradual lowering of light allowed the eyes and mind to adjust together, easing the body towards sleep without force. Quiet conversations often filled these moments. Families spoke in lowered voices, sharing brief reflections from the day. Children listened as elders spoke softly, their words blending with the background sounds of the night. In many homes, short prayers or expressions of gratitude were whispered, acknowledging both the safety of the shelter and the uncertainty of the coming darkness. The body responded naturally to these rituals. Muscles relaxed. Breathing slowed. Without stimulation or urgency, tiredness emerged on its own. Sleep did not need to be invited or chased. It arrived as the final step in a sequence that had been practiced for generations. In these ancient routines, there was no separation between preparation and rest. Bedtime was not a task to complete, but a gentle narrowing of attention. As distractions faded, the mind turned inward, guided by familiarity and repetition. These nightly habits formed a bridge between waking life and sleep, allowing rest to feel safe and expected. And as the lamps dimmed and voices fell silent, sleep followed quietly, carried forward by rhythms older than memory. In the medieval world, sleep was shaped by simplicity, routine, and the shared spaces of daily life. Most people did not sleep alone. Families gathered in a single room at night, bringing their day to a close together. Privacy, as we understand it today, was rare, but familiarity created a sense of safety that made rest possible. Beds varied widely depending on status and location. Wealthier households owned wooden frames fitted with ropes or woven supports, topped with mattresses stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers. For many others, sleep took place on pallets laid directly on the floor, layered with blankets or animal skins. Comfort came from warmth and closeness rather than luxury. Medieval homes were built to protect against the elements. Thick walls kept out cold winds, while small windows limited drafts and light. At night, these spaces grew dim quickly. Candles and hearth fires were allowed to burn low, providing just enough light to move safely before rest. Fire was treated with care, as uncontrolled flames posed serious danger. Nighttime was quieter than daytime, though never entirely silent. The crackle of cooling embers, the shifting of bodies, and the occasional sound from outside formed a steady backdrop. In rural areas, the presence of animals was constant. In towns, distant footsteps and voices reminded sleepers that life continued quietly beyond their walls. Sleep during this period was often divided. Many people experienced what later historians would call first sleep and second sleep. After resting for several hours, they would wake naturally in the middle of the night. This time was not considered troubling. People prayed, reflected, or spoke softly before returning to rest until morning. Religious belief influenced sleep as well. Night was a time for reflection, and rest was seen as part of a divine order. Evening prayers offered comfort, and morning routines began early, aligned with daylight rather than clocks. In the medieval world, sleep was not expected to be perfect or uninterrupted. It followed the body's natural signals, shaped by darkness, labor, and shared living. Rest arrived as a pause within a cycle that repeated each day, steady and familiar. Sleeping arrangements in the ancient world were shaped less by personal preference and more by necessity. Space was limited, and warmth was valuable. As a result, people often slept together, sharing rooms, beds, or sleeping surfaces with family members and, at times, with others outside the household. This closeness was not considered unusual. It was simply part of life. In many homes, a single sleeping area served everyone. Parents, children, and sometimes extended family settled into place as night fell. Bodies were arranged carefully to conserve heat, especially during colder months. Blankets were shared. The presence of others offered reassurance in the dark, reinforcing a sense of protection through proximity. Travelers experienced similar conditions. Inns and guest houses provided basic shelter rather than privacy. Beds were often communal, filled as needed by those passing through. For many, sleeping beside strangers was accepted without discomfort. Fatigue eased concerns, and routine replaced hesitation. The expectation of solitude in sleep was still far in the future. Even in more privileged households, servants and apprentices slept nearby, often within the same building. Their rest followed the same rhythms as those they served. The night gathered everyone into a shared stillness, dissolving boundaries that were more firmly drawn during the day. Despite the lack of separation, sleep remained personal. People learned to rest amid movement, breathing, and quiet sounds. The presence of others faded into the background as the body settled. Familiar noises became part of the night's rhythm, no more disruptive than wind or distant animals. Over time, these shared sleeping arrangements shaped how people understood rest. Sleep was not an isolated experience. It was woven into the collective life of the household or community. The night belonged to everyone, and rest was taken together, shaped by trust and habit. As darkness deepened and the household grew still, individual thoughts softened. Within shared spaces, sleep arrived quietly, carried by warmth, repetition, and the comfort of not being alone. Sleep in the ancient world was shaped not only by comfort and routine, but also by the small disturbances that naturally accompanied the night. These interruptions were expected, rarely resisted, and often accepted as part of resting itself. Rather than being sources of frustration, they blended quietly into the rhythm of sleep. Changes in temperature were among the most common challenges. As night deepened, the air cooled, sometimes sharply. People adjusted by pulling blankets closer, shifting positions, or moving nearer to others for warmth. In warmer climates, heat lingered into the night, making rooftops or open courtyards the preferred places for rest. Sleep adapted easily to these changes. Sounds were another constant presence. Animals moved through fields and streets. Insects filled the darkness with steady rhythms. In towns, distant footsteps or the closing of doors echoed faintly. These sounds were familiar, rarely startling. Over time, the mind learned to treat them as background, allowing rest to continue without interruption. Light itself could disturb sleep. Moonlight shifted across rooms as the night progressed. Clouds briefly dimmed or revealed the sky. Flickering lamps cast moving shadows before being extinguished. Rather than resisting these changes, people adjusted naturally, turning away from light or closing their eyes more fully. Illness, discomfort, and worry occasionally surfaced in the quiet hours. Without distractions, the mind sometimes wandered. Yet even these moments were understood as temporary. Sleep was not expected to be constant or perfect. Waking was part of resting, just as stillness followed movement. In the absence of strict schedules, people did not measure sleep by hours. They rested when they were tired and rose when the body signaled readiness. Short awakenings did not carry meaning or concern. They passed quietly, often unnoticed by morning. In this way, Sleep in the ancient world remained flexible and forgiving. It bent gently around the realities of the night, allowing rest to continue even when conditions were less than ideal. Rather than breaking sleep, these disturbances became part of it, woven seamlessly into the experience of the night. Without artificial light or constant stimulation, the human body in the ancient world followed rhythms that were closely aligned with nature. Sleep was guided by the rising and setting of the sun, the gradual darkening of the sky, and the steady accumulation of physical tiredness. These natural patterns shaped rest in ways that required little effort or intention. Daily labor played an important role. Most people spent their days engaged in physical work, whether farming, building, walking long distances, or performing repetitive tasks by hand. By nightfall, the body was genuinely tired. Muscles relaxed easily, and rest followed naturally. Sleep was not something to be planned. It arrived as a response to exertion. The absence of artificial light allowed internal rhythms to function without interference. As evening progressed, the body adjusted gradually. Alertness faded. Breathing slowed. The mind grew quieter. Without screens or bright lamps, there were fewer distractions to delay rest. The transition into sleep felt unforced, guided by signals the body understood instinctively. Nighttime awakenings did not disrupt these rhythms. Waking briefly in darkness did not bring urgency or stimulation. There was little to do and nowhere to go. Without light, the body remained oriented toward rest. After a short period of wakefulness, sleep returned on its own. Seasonal changes also influenced sleep. Longer nights in winter encouraged extended periods of rest, while shorter summer nights brought earlier mornings. These shifts were accepted without resistance. Sleep adjusted itself to the natural cycle of the year, expanding and contracting as needed. In this environment, the body's relationship with sleep was cooperative rather than strained. Rest was neither scarce nor pursued. It was a natural outcome of living within the limits set by daylight and darkness. The body knew when to sleep, and it was allowed to follow that knowledge without interruption. As we reflect on these ancient rhythms, it becomes clear that sleep once flowed easily within daily life. It followed patterns shaped over generations, responding quietly to the world as it was, rather than forcing the body to adapt against its own nature. Across cultures and centuries, sleep served as a quiet reset, a pause that allowed life to continue without strain. In the ancient world, rest was not separated from daily existence. It was woven into it, returning balance after effort and preparing the body for the day to come. Night offered a natural boundary. When darkness settled, activity faded without resistance. There was no expectation to remain productive, no pressure to extend the day beyond its limits. Sleep marked the closing of one cycle and the quiet beginning of another. Each night mirrored the last, providing stability through repetition. This rhythm brought reassurance. Even in uncertain times, the arrival of night remained dependable. The body learned to trust this pattern, releasing tension as evening progressed. Rest was not earned through accomplishment. It arrived simply because the day had ended. Sleep also connected people across generations. The way bodies slowed, breathing softened, and awareness faded was the same for those who lived thousands of years ago as it is today. Though surroundings have changed, the need for rest has remained constant. In this shared experience, ancient and modern lives quietly meet. In the absence of constant stimulation, the mind settled more easily. Thoughts drifted without urgency. Memories faded gently into the background. Sleep was allowed to come and go naturally, without judgment or expectation. Waking during the night did not signal failure, but transition. As night deepened, households grew still. Fires cooled. Lamps dimmed. The world rested together, suspended in darkness until the return of light. This collective pause offered more than physical rest. It restored a sense of continuity, reminding people that tomorrow would arrive in its own time. In this way, sleep in the ancient world was both ordinary and essential. It required no explanation, no optimization. It simply followed the steady rhythm of life itself, renewing the body quietly, night after night. As we reach the end of this calm journey through the ancient world, it becomes clear that sleep has always been a shared human experience, shaped by darkness, routine, and the quiet passing of time. Long before modern concerns and artificial light, rest followed simple patterns that required little effort to maintain. The night arrived, the body responded, and sleep found its place naturally. Though centuries have passed and daily life has changed, the body still carries echoes of these older rhythms. Beneath modern habits and distractions, the same need for rest remains. The slow descent into sleep, guided by familiarity and repetition, is something deeply rooted, carried forward through countless generations. In the ancient world, sleep was not expected to solve problems or restore energy perfectly. It was allowed to be imperfect, flexible, and forgiving. Waking during the night was normal. Rest returned when it was ready. There was no urgency, no measurement, and no pressure to control the process. Sleep simply followed its own quiet logic. As night deepened, people trusted in the return of morning without needing to watch the clock. Darkness offered a pause from effort, allowing the mind and body to soften together. This acceptance created a kind of peace that required no explanation. Tonight, there is no need to think about how sleep should happen. Like those who rested under ancient skies, you can allow the night to unfold at its own pace. Whether sleep comes quickly or slowly, it remains part of a natural rhythm that has guided humanity for thousands of years. As the world grows quieter, let this sense of continuity remain with you. The same night that once covered rivers, cities, and fields now surrounds you as well. In that shared stillness, rest is never far away.